Hi everyone, Peter here from Flow High Performance, and in this video we will cover whether we should prioritize training quality versus quantity to maximize muscle growth. First, let's cover what exactly we mean when referring to quality versus quantity. Training quality refers to the hypertrophic stimulus of each set. This includes a few different components such as lifting performance, technique, proximity to failure, and training intent. Quantity, on the other hand, refers to training volume, as calculated by the total number of sets performed per muscle group per week. Both of these factors are important for long-term muscle growth, and both should be considered for an effective training program. Ideally, we want to have high quality and quantity of training to maximize hypertrophy, although unfortunately, there is an inherent trade-off. If we increase volume, we generally see a slight decrease in training quality. And if we decrease volume, we generally see an improvement in training quality. This is due to a number of factors which we will now discuss. The first is due to acute fatigue. The more total number of sets we perform in a single session for a muscle group, the more short-term fatigue we will accumulate. This means that for each subsequent set, our potential performance will be inhibited. So by the end of a high-volume training session, performance will probably be not as stimulative compared with the sets at the beginning of the session. Another influential factor is interset rest periods. While this is not always the case, most of the time, trainees will shorten rest periods when training with higher volumes. This is because if rest periods were equal, the training session will be extended with higher volumes. So whether this is conscious or subconscious, trainees will likely shorten their rest periods to complete the training session in a reasonable time frame. This will reduce lifting performance and overall quality of each subsequent set compared with longer interset rest periods. And as we know from the scientific literature, longer interset rest periods seem to be slightly superior for muscle growth compared with shorter rest periods. For example, this study found that resting for 3 minutes between sets resulted in slightly superior muscle growth compared with resting for 1 minute between sets. And the last factor influencing quality versus quantity is intent and motivation. While most enthusiastic lifters have a strong work ethic and train with high effort, there is inevitably a finite amount of mental energy we have for each session and throughout the week. So if we train with a high volume, we may end up training with less intent towards the end of each session, which means training quality is likely to suffer slightly. Luckily, we don't have to train to complete failure with each set to achieve significant hypertrophy adaptations, but training closer to failure generally results in slightly superior muscle growth. This can be seen in this meta-analysis, which showed that training to failure may be slightly superior than not training to failure for hypertrophy adaptations. Furthermore, training closer to failure seems to be more important when training with higher rep ranges. For example, this study showed that training to failure was superior than leaving a few reps in reserve when training with lighter loads and higher rep ranges. However, there was no difference between training to failure and leaving a few reps in reserve when using heavier loads and lower rep ranges. Furthermore, a lack of intent may inhibit our lifting technique too. As our concentration starts to diminish towards the end of a high volume training session, we generally become less worried about training with strict and effective technique and probably more concerned about what we will do after our training session. As a result, we may potentially end up training with suboptimal technique, reducing tension on the target muscle. So now we understand what the quality versus quantity trade-off means. The question now becomes, which should we prioritize to maximize muscle growth? To understand this, let's look at the research on training volume. This notorious study explored the effects of training with different weekly volumes. As expected, it was found that training with high volumes resulted in greater muscle growth compared with lower and moderate volumes. This was the case despite some muscle groups like the quads, for example, being trained with up to 45 weekly sets and still seeing superior muscle growth. So although training quality would probably have been significantly inhibited towards the end of these high volume training sessions, it still resulted in superior growth. However, another variable to consider in this study is hypertrophy efficiency. This refers to the amount of muscle growth seen per unit of volume. In other words, hypertrophy per set. I calculated this by dividing muscle growth by the number of sets performed for that muscle group giving me the hypertrophy efficiency of each training protocol. This graph shows the percentage of hypertrophy per set per week for each muscle group measured in the study. As we can see, hypertrophy efficiency was greatest in the low volume group and became progressively lower in the moderate and high volume groups. This suggests that there may be diminishing returns as more volume is performed. This may be a result of our physiological response to resistance training, or it may be a result of diminishing quality as the session progresses. This brings up the idea of junk volume. This refers to the idea that when weekly volume becomes excessively high, the sets towards the end of the workout are such low quality that we aren't getting much out of them. So the hypertrophy response is not worth the time and energy cost of training. In other words, the stimulus to fatigue ratio is inferior. While I don't believe that there is such thing as true junk volume, meaning sets that are not hypertrophic at all, there certainly seems to be diminishing returns as volume increases, as we demonstrated in the previous study. So while more volume definitely seems to result in superior total muscle growth, it is not a linear dose response. This relationship may theoretically look something like this. As we can see, our initial sets are more effective and result in the majority of hypertrophy gains. However, as we perform more and more volume, we still see more muscle growth, but the effectiveness of each set is progressively inferior. So the real question here is, where should the cutoff be? When do we decide that more volume is simply not worth the additional time and effort? Let's now establish some practical recommendations to help lifters decide how much emphasis should be placed on each side of the equation. First, we should understand that there is no best or optimal ratio of quality versus quantity. Rather, it will be individual for each trainee based on numerous factors. However, here are some general guidelines to help you make the most informed decision and get the most out of your training. In my opinion, I think for all lifters, quality should be the first priority before considering increasing volume. This means lifting with strict and effective technique, ensuring we are training with high effort levels, have focus and intent with each and every set, and enjoy our training sessions. Keeping these factors in check will ensure our training efficiency is very high so that we aren't unnecessarily increasing time spent in the gym. It should also be noted that training quality is something that will usually be progressively improved over a lifter's entire training career and continually developed. This isn't something that we simply switch on and off, it is a long-term process that we should continually strive to improve. Assuming we are emphasizing training quality and continually trying to improve our training quality over time, we can then consider increasing training volume. This will generally result in greater muscle growth, assuming we are still training with high quality. As we perform more and more volume, we are likely to experience greater muscle growth with each additional set. So how much volume should we add? Well, I generally like to recommend that trainees should perform as much high quality volume as they can manage within 3 distinct constraints. First is joint tolerance. There is a limited amount of volume we can perform until we place too much stress on the joints and connective tissue and develop pain or injury over time. Second is systemic fatigue. This refers to the overall fatigue induced by both exercise and other life stresses. Once again, there is a finite amount of volume we can perform before we become excessively fatigued and see negative health and performance consequences. And third is practical limitations. Even if we can physically perform more volume, it may not be practical for our lifestyle or preferences. Not everyone can or wants to spend multiple hours in the gym each and every day, so we must respect our practical preferences. So as a general rule, trainees should probably try to maximize how much volume they can perform within these 3 general constraints. Furthermore, we may find that if we push our volume too high, we may start to sacrifice training quality, making our training sessions less efficient. In this case, it may be wise to cap your training volume before this occurs to ensure quality is high and we aren't spending more time in the gym than we need to. Here are some general indicators that our quality is starting to diminish. First is lifting performance. If you find that towards the end of your training sessions, your performance of the last few sets are very poor compared to what you would be able to lift in a fresh state, then this is an indicator that training quality is not ideal. Second is your concentration and intent in the gym. If you feel that towards the end of your training sessions, you are not really concentrating on lifting and your intent to stress the muscle is lacking, then this may be an indicator that quality is diminishing. And last is training motivation. If you feel that you are not very motivated for your training sessions and are rather more stressed about training, then your quality may be diminishing. Trainees can use these general guidelines to make their own informed decisions about how much emphasis they want to place on each side of this equation. Thanks for watching, and hopefully you got something out of this video. Check out flowhighperformance.com for online coaching, training templates, ebooks, and more.